Welcome to the video lecture for Chapter 6 of the Hick text in the Intro to Social Welfare course at Trent. I'm Tara LaRose, and I'm going to guide you through Chapter 6 and talk to you about the relationship between social welfare and poverty, and to consider some of the social programs and resources that we've developed to support people who are living in poverty and to gain greater understandings about poverty more generally in society. As with many of the social welfare programs that we have in Canada, we rely on global understandings of poverty in order to frame our national, regional, and local understandings of poverty. Poverty is understood to be more than just having a lack of money, and complex relationships between people's experiences of their life and their income are created under these UN definitions. We see here that the UN defines poverty as in part about life choices and about having the kind of life that you'd like to live. The World Bank uses the benchmark of $1 per day to define absolute poverty, a concept that we'll talk about a little bit later in the lecture. We know that poverty is also a persistent reality and that a significant portion of people at the global level live in poverty. And while Canada might be understood as a very wealthy nation, many people in Canada are affected by poverty, they live in poverty, and in particular, children are highly affected by poverty in Canada. As I mentioned, the UN uses two definitions to consider and think about poverty. The first is absolute poverty, and the second is relative poverty. These two concepts really speak to a kind of definition of goods and services needed by people in poverty and a measure of whether or not people have what they need in order to survive, versus a more experiential understanding of poverty as something that relates to you fitting in to the society in which you live. To focus on this idea of absolute poverty for a moment, in the photo that follows, we see an example of the experience of children who are living in that reality of less than $1 a day. They do not have the things that they need in order to have a healthy life. We might see this market basket as a kind of Canadian comparison. This basket represents the food someone might obtain through a food bank for 1 month. It's not a lot, and there's not a lot of extras. However, it is substantially more than the $1 a day model that the UN uses to measure absolute poverty. Let's turn our attention for a moment to the concept of relative poverty. Relative poverty is significantly different than absolute poverty in that people's basic physical survival is not brought into question within relative poverty. But the effects of poverty and people's inability to participate actively in society as a result of poverty, both because of a lack of resources and because of the social stigma of poverty, makes relative poverty a serious concern and a serious issue in the welfare state, for the welfare state. You'll see a link to a website called GDP, which is a National Film Board of Canada experimental digital media presentation about this idea of relative poverty in the context of the recent recession. And I'd encourage you to have a close look at some of the material on this website because I think it provides you with a very, very vivid picture of the reality of relative poverty. The concept of relative poverty is a concept that is contextual in nature. So the meaning of relative poverty changes from location to location and potentially from person to person. In the Canadian welfare state, we use a measure called the low income cutoff to understand really what it means to be poor and what it means to have a low income. The low income cutoff takes into consideration the unique experiences of people who live from coast to coast. If you live in British Columbia, you probably won't need as much heating fuel as if you live in Labrador. And so the low income measurement, the low income cutoff, gives us the capacity to understand what it means to be a low income earner in the context of the particular region, place, or space where the person we're considering or the group of people we're considering are located. Because we're talking about poverty in the context of a capitalist economic system, being able to participate in the market is a part of what we understand as being a citizen with full rights. The measure of the market basket is one of the measures used to link experiences of poverty to the market. People need and buy certain things every month, every season, every year. And so the market basket considers what it is that people are buying and what the cost is of purchasing those goods. The low income measure allows us to engage in comparison based on population. As I mentioned before, the capitalist economic system sees full citizenship as the capacity to participate in the market, to sell your labor, and to purchase goods and services to meet your needs and desires. Poverty limits people's capacity to participate in the market economy. There is a social stigma associated with poverty, and so both a lack of resources and the potential of stigmatization may limit people's capacity to engage in the community. This incapacity can be understood as the concept of social exclusion. We know that people who experience greater levels of poverty may also experience greater levels of social exclusion. And so poverty is not only seen as something that affects the physical self, but as something that affects the emotional self and also the life chances of the person, because we know that participating in the community actively is one of the things that helps us make networks and connections, to forge relationships that can be helpful in supporting us throughout our life and in meeting our needs for things like employment or retraining or mentorship. The social stigma that I just mentioned can lead to or be perpetrated or perpetuated through myths about the poor. You'll see here that the myths Hick lists have a close relationship to the beliefs of the poor that were promoted under the British Poor Law. Some of these myths focus on the individual, and other myths focus on the larger society, and in particular on the welfare system or welfare state. In particular, Hick draws our attention to the idea of myths about the cost of social programs and frame this cost as a kind of wasteful expenditure. In order to solve the problem of poverty, we have to develop explanations or understandings about the causes of poverty. Hick introduces three distinct perspectives on poverty: the human capital, market economy, and political economy perspectives, and explores each of these in the next few slides. The human capital perspective is infused with understandings of the market as a place that can improve the welfare of people. The human capital perspective emphasizes the idea that people who experience poverty must require some kind of input in order to improve their chances of escaping poverty. This perspective relies heavily on assessing people's strengths and their particular skills, relating these to their individual or personal characteristics, and engaging in some kind of individual modification, perhaps retraining, perhaps training on how to look for work. And it assumes that people who are living in poverty are in some way in a cycle of poverty, which the human capital perspective wants to eliminate. Like the liberal humanist perspective that the market economy perspective relates to, the market economy understands that there are systemic factors that need to be addressed when we consider issues of poverty. The broader economic system and the social forces that can influence the reality of the economic system can affect individuals. We don't opt for a full employment model in a capitalist economic system, and we know that some people face greater barriers to accessing employment or to being employable under this particular model. And so things like socialization and factors that relate to discrimination are considered under the market economy perspective. While individuals are still seen to hold responsibility for their own experiences of poverty, there is a desire to link these to systemic factors. The political economy perspective is concerned with the ideological nature of economic policy. So there's a close relationship between systemic factors, values, and the outcomes that people experience both at the social and at the individual level. This perspective acknowledges that capitalism is a system of exploitation, and so full employment is never the goal of capitalism. The wages and working conditions faced by people who are selling their labor are directly influenced by the people who own the businesses in which they work or the means of production that they're associated with. The stratification of the market in this way means that there are many people who experience exploitation in particular ways, which we might understand as oppression. And so factors like gender, age, race, sexual orientation, ability, religion, all of these things can influence who is the least employable based on the system of exploitation that is inherent in the way we organize work. Within the social welfare state, there's a lot of work that goes into the process of quantifying experiences of poverty. 3 of the models that Hick identifies for us are the head count, the poverty gap, and the poverty duration model of quantification. In theory, the poverty head count allows us to count how many people are experiencing poverty based on the low income cutoff, knowing of course that the low income cutoff can change regionally and from year to year. One of the challenges is that not everyone is included in the poverty head count. For example, Aboriginal people living on reserve are not included in the poverty head count. And I would suggest that perhaps this might alter the statistics about the number of people living in poverty in particular areas of the country. We also see here, based on Hick's information, that people who are living in institutional homes, so for example, people living in nursing homes, are also not included in this context. And once again, this would probably alter our poverty statistic quite substantially. According to the statistics based on headcount, we see that BC has the highest level of poverty, whereas PEI has the lowest. The depth of poverty perspective looks at how poor people are. So it looks at how much lower than the low income cutoff are people actually living. So we start to look at statistics around family composition and the relationship between the low income cutoff and family composition. This index tells us something about how severe people's poverty is, based on a kind of quantification of that experience. The poverty duration model looks at how long someone might live in poverty, or how long more broadly or more globally the statistics suggest the average period of poverty is. These statistics tell us how things are improving or how things are becoming worse for people generally within the society. This approach to looking at poverty also tells us whether poverty is situational or systemic. If you lose your job, you might experience poverty for a short period of time while you look for another job. Other people have extended periods of time when they live in poverty, or their wages do not sufficiently meet their needs, or considerably lower than the low income cutoff. This could be because of the family composition, for example. And so, again, this kind of way of looking at poverty from a quantitative perspective gives us some information, but doesn't really tell us the specifics of why. We've talked about the notion of inequality several times in the course so far, and I expect we'll talk about it a few more times before the course ends. As Hick suggests to us, we can understand poverty as a benchmark that tells us something about how a person negotiates the world and accesses the resources they need to have the life they want to have. But understanding who experiences poverty most frequently, or who is at the greatest disadvantage within society, is an important thing to understand. Understanding why some people might experience long-term poverty while other people experience a situational poverty is also something we might want to know. And this leads us to consider notions of inequality and who it is that experiences these phenomena. It allows us to think about patterns and what these patterns mean for our society, and how it is that we might develop social welfare policy in order to change those patterns. Hick reminds us that we might also talk about income distribution, or how our demographics and levels of income are interrelated. The social assistance programs that are delivered in a Canadian context are very closely related to our history with the British Poor Law. So the British Poor Law model emphasized things like lesser eligibility, or the distribution of resources at a level that were less than the lowest possible wage one could earn in paid employment. We continue that kind of model, ensuring that there is only a bare minimum payment made to people who have no other income or nowhere else to turn for supports. This is based on a needs test, and that is proof that you need the income support program, and an assessment of your assets and other resources. If you have a lot of assets or other potential sources of income, then you will be deemed ineligible to receive social assistance. Each province and territory administers their own system. Oftentimes they contract with municipal governments to provide those resources. And so we've talked previously in one of the other slide decks about the fact that the region of Durham, or the region of Haliburton, or the region of Kawartha provide Ontario Works on behalf of the province. Social assistance programs have specific criteria for eligibility. People must meet this criteria in order to receive benefits. This eligibility system hopes to prevent overlap between the social assistance system and other systems, so for example the pension system. However, in the process of creating these kinds of social assistance criteria, there have been times when some people have been left out of the system. So for example, there was a time when people under the age of 18 but over the age of 16 who had potentially been discharged from foster care were ineligible for social assistance, but no longer eligible for foster care. And so there was no social program to meet their needs. And eventually, I think there were programs and services that were worked out with social assistance that would allow for specific criteria for people who were over 16 but under 18. But there are other places in the system that you may find if you're working within the system as a social worker or as a sociologist or as a psychologist, that there are mismatches or gaps that exist between the design of the social programs, and some people fall through those cracks. These eligibility criteria are subdivided into categories of eligibility within the eligibility model. And so there may be ways where there might be reasons why someone is eligible to receive the program, and then other reasons why they're ineligible to receive the program. So for example, you might meet the test for needs, but not meet the test for residency, for example. And so the criteria really covers financial, administrative, and other reasons for providing assistance or disallowing assistance. If you're working in the system, this eligibility criteria is a part of what workers do when they administer social assistance to people who are requiring this resource. There are many different debates about social assistance and how effective it is. Debates about whether it pays too much, it pays too little, it pays the wrong people, debates about it doing too little, debates about it creating dependency. What we do know is that in most instances, social assistance programs in Canada pay a very low income to people and keep people in places of relative poverty, a kind of relative poverty that can be difficult to escape from. The working poor are people who experience poverty, even though they engage in employment within the paid labor market. The status of working poverty, when considered demographically, shows a number of trends, with younger workers and workers who experience some kind of marginalization because they're immigrants or racialized people are also more likely to experience working poverty. We also know that single parents, often parents who are, women, experience working poverty, and there is a relationship between level of education and working poor status. It raises a number of questions about the minimum wage and how we make changes to our system of work to ensure everyone who engages in work within the paid labor market can have enough to meet their needs. Homelessness is another issue that we're concerned with when we consider poverty. So there are two characteristics or two categories, of homelessness, one being absolute homelessness and the other one being relative homelessness. Being absolutely homeless means that you have no shelter, no access to housing, whereas relative homelessness means that people are underhoused or their housing is extremely unstable. So someone who is surfing couches or staying with friends, bouncing in and out of the shelter system and staying with friends would be understood as relatively homeless. The demographics of homeless people have changed considerably over the last 20 years, and governments seem hesitant to participate in the development of affordable housing. So it's likely that this trend will continue. I expect that over the course of this course and other courses, we'll talk more about the specifics of homelessness. There are a variety of different reasons why people experience homelessness, and we often think of mental health issues or substance abuse as a significant factor in homelessness, and certainly these are significant issues. In both instances, there's a lack of supportive housing to provide good homes and stable environments to people experiencing these phenomena, these personal experiences. Group home settings or lodging homes or rooming houses tend to be undesirable environments, and there are many people who would prefer to live outside of these environments rather than live in them. We know that the changing demographics have created what some people refer to as hidden homelessness. And so families who are living in shelters or who are living in significantly inadequate housing contexts can be included in this notion of homelessness. Some people have argued that we need to house people before we try to deal with other social problems that they may be experiencing. And so this move has advocated for increased affordable housing. And it's a model that harkens back to the post-war era when the Canadian government began to develop public housing projects like Regent Park in Toronto. Food and nutrition are important issues when we're considering the issue of poverty. And we know that more and more people are turning to food banks in order to eat on a daily basis. Most food bank programs in Canada are volunteer run, and the food that they have is exclusively provided by donations or purchased by the organization because of cash donations. Some of the challenges with food banks is that they tend to have, generally balanced nutrition. If you're someone who's living on food bank food for an extended period of time, then you may suffer from some kinds of malnutrition or poor eating habits as a result. We also know that because these organizations are volunteer run, sometimes people experience discrimination when they use the food bank. Another issue in food insecurity is the concept of a food desert. In many urban areas, there are very few grocery stores, with grocery stores being concentrated in big box malls, which can be quite difficult to get to if you're someone who does not have a car. And so as a result, people are forced to purchase their food in less than ideal locations, for example, in variety stores, which raises the cost of their monthly food and decreases their capacity to access good, fresh, healthy food. We've talked before about the idea that social welfare can sometimes be a morality project, and certainly there are a number of realities that people who receive social assistance and other welfare benefits face. Hick considers workfare, the spouse in the house rule, and welfare fraud as three issues worthy of closer consideration when we talk about this idea of morality and poverty. If you watched the earlier video called Parking Lots and Ideology, some of this will be a repeat for you. But there are particular perspectives within the social welfare model that argue people are experiencing poverty and or unemployment because they need to be retrained. They need to receive additional skills for working, additional skills for seeking work, and skills for maintaining work. Workfare is one of the ways in which these skills, and I use the term with quotations around it, are taught to people through government programs. Under workfare models, people are expected to engage in work in order to receive their general welfare benefits. This could include volunteer work, which is the model most often used in Ontario, or actual paid work, which is a model used in the US. In Canada, people participating in workfare often volunteer for charity organizations and are expected to do a particular number of hours at a particular number of tasks in order to develop skills to improve their chances of getting a job. In the US, workers may be actually put into paid employment in for-profit contexts, for example in fast food restaurants, as a way of developing what they refer to as real job skills. The challenge with this is that the principle of social assistance models in Canada and in the US is a lesser eligibility model. And so this decreases the value of the labor that the people who are participating in welfare it decreases the value of their labor, and it creates a kind of downward pressure on all work. But it's also making assumptions about what the source of poverty and unemployment is, and it disregards a number of the structural factors that we've spoken about. The spouse in the house rule has a very long history in social welfare programs. This rule suggested that people who were receiving social assistance benefits should not be allowed to have a spouse or to have a relationship, a romantic or sexual relationship with a partner. If we scratch below the surface a little bit more, what it actually referred to was the policing of women and women's sexuality and women's morality. Women who were receiving benefits were not supposed to have romantic relationships with, well, from a heteronormative perspective, with men. This was seen to potentially place the state at the risk of having to pay for an unintended pregnancy and then to provide benefits to the child that might result. This kind of moral policing gave authority to social workers and other people administering social assistance programs to search women's houses to ensure that there was no spouse in the house. So they would do things like check under the bed to see if there were men's shoes, look for laundry that might belong to a partner, and so on. This perspective has been challenged, and some of the heteronormative assumptions that are embedded in it also challenged. And so as a result of a challenge to the Charter, new policies had to be created to eliminate assumptions about the meaning of a spouse in the house, and these were introduced, as Hick outlines above, in 2002. The spouse in the house rule assumes or normalizes a male breadwinner model, and it penalizes women who don't want to operate within this model and who want to maintain their own financial independence while still having romantic and sexual relationships. It's an antiquated idea, but it's a hangover that we still have from our old understandings of social welfare as a project of morality. This concludes the video lecture for Chapter 6, and I'll look forward to presenting to you when we get to Chapter 7.